Hello, and welcome to the newest episode of On the Odd. If you enjoy On the Odd, please consider supporting the show at patreon.com/ontheodd.
From the paranormal to the extraordinary, from the weird to the wonderful, this is On the Odd.
Today, we have a very special guest. Her name is Stacy Horn. She's the author of 5 nonfiction books: Unbelievable Imperfect Harmony, Finding Happiness Singing with Others, Waiting for My Cats to Die, a Memoir, The Restless Sleep Inside New York City's Cold Case Squad, and Damnation Island, Poor, Sick, Mad, and Criminal in a 19th Century New York. That's 4 books. I don't think I wrote down the 5th one, did I? I'm sorry about that, Stacy.
It doesn't matter.
What is the missing title?
I think you missed my first book, Cyberville, which was about the internet and an online social network I started called Echo.
Oh, okay. I do want to bring that up. I also want to add, Stacy's commentaries can be heard on NPR's All Things Considered, and she's the founder of, as she just mentioned, social network Echo. Please welcome to the show, Stacy Horn. Thank you so much for putting up with my little tech issues and miscommunication on my end.
No problem, and thank you for inviting me.
Oh, anytime. Once you're on the show, you're going to get pestered by me every once in a while, so hopefully you won't be too pestered. I wanted to ask, I guess going back to the very beginning of all of this, you probably get asked this very often, is how did you first get involved with, I guess, this darker matter? The darker history of New York, I guess. And I guess my focus mostly is Damnation Island, which is, it's a really fascinating book.
All my books are dark. For whatever reason, I have always been attracted to dark stories, sad stories, terrible stories, and I'm not entirely sure why. Mm-hmm. But I do get enormous satisfaction when I find out about something that's happened, something bad that people have forgotten, and bringing attention back to it. And this story was just like the epitome of that. I mean, thousands and thousands of people, like 40 to 55,000 people were sent to this island every year in the 19th century. And terrible things happened to them, and most people don't even know this ever went on. And I feel like I'm resurrecting these poor souls and providing at least some sense of justice.
I have to agree with you. I find a fascination, too, with finding forgotten history. And in New York, for whatever reason, in New York, there's a lot of it. And very often you'll uncover these darker stories. I don't know if I read it in your book or I might have come across an interview of yours. I'm not really sure. But you brought up a story about one of the cases of where this pregnant woman was put in a straitjacket and put in, I think, what as a kid we would call this the rubber room for crazy people. Yeah. And she was just left there. And she actually gave birth in a straitjacket alone. Yeah. I mean, to me, as a man, I find it completely disturbing. But to have been there with my wife when my child was born, to imagine this going on with no one else, no no support, nothing, no doctor, nothing, no medical anything I can't think of things more horrifying, actually.
Yeah. And in a straitjacket, so you don't even have your hands or your arms to deal with the situation. You're just writhing on the floor. I also agree. But maybe I should step back and just explain what was going on, like just the backstory.
Sure.
This.
Yeah, I always jump around. I always jump way ahead and go right for the last. I will often read the last few pages of a book. Sorry.
It's absolutely fine. The last few pages of my book are as horrifying as the beginning.
I agree. Anywhere you flip this book open, you come across something that is not only educational but eye-opening.
Yeah. There were very few heroes in this story. But I want to get back to that because there were heroes. Or not heroes, but at least people who tried. But the book begins in the early 19th century in New York City, and Bellevue, which is now known mostly as a hospital, a public hospital, was also where the city had its lunatic asylum, a couple of penal institutions, an almshouse for the homeless poor. Mm-hmm. And because they had all these, different institutions shoved together, it was horribly overcrowded and inhumane, and the city recognized this and that they had to do something about it. And they came up with what was a really good idea, or at least seemed like a really good idea at the time, to buy Blackwell's Island. This is the island known as Roosevelt Island. It's a 2-mile-long island in the East River alongside Manhattan. And it was owned by a private family, the Blackwell family, and it was, their house and a bunch of fruit orchards. Mm-hmm. And so their idea was that they would build all these replacement institutions and build them, state of the art. They researched everything. They went down to Philadelphia to visit a new asylum that had gone up there. That was based on something that was very revolutionary at the time, something called moral treatment. Prior to this new form of treatment, lunatics, and I'm using that term because that was the term used in the 19th century.
Sure.
They were thrown into prison. They were put in straitjackets. The treatment consisted of barbaric practices like bloodletting. And so moral treatment was, and it just seems like common sense now. It's like, why don't we treat them with compassion? And instead of throwing them into jail cells, why don't we put them in a hospital with comfortable, healthful settings, feed them well, give them things to do, find occupations for them. Entertainments, clothe them properly. And if we treat them with kindness, maybe they will respond better. And of course they did. So this was their idea. And so they thought, we'll send all these people, the poor, the sick, and criminals who have been convicted of crimes to these brand new institutions where they'll get either reform if they were convicted of a crime, or healing if they were sick or suffering from mental disorders. And they'll come back to the city in better shape than they left. But
on paper, it sounds great.
Exactly. But they just made so many mistakes. And probably one of their bigger mistakes was just this idea of putting these very different groups all together, exiled away from everyone else, which again was seen as sending them away to a sanctuary, not as exiling them. But in practice, it was exiling them. And it created this really destructive association in the minds of the general public and the government that these groups were more or less the same. Like the poor were really thieves in disguise. The mentally ill were dangerous. And together with people who were actually convicted of crimes, they were all guilty of something. Mm-hmm. And this association persists to this day. They also underestimated how much it was going to cost. It's very expensive to run an asylum properly, for instance. And finally, they underestimated just how many people were ultimately going to be sent to the island and put in each of these institutions. So they were once again, within a matter of a few years, horribly overcrowded. I have this quote from Charles Dickens that I put in the book. He visited the lunatic asylum 3 years after it opened, and his description of it sounds like something in the worst of his novels. And I'll just read a little piece of it.
Sure.
He wrote that it had that madhouse air, the moping idiot, the gibbering maniac with his hideous laugh and pointed finger. They were all there in naked ugliness and horror.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that really paints such a vivid picture of a place that no one wants to be.
Yeah.
What year was it that they opened? I think you said it, but I missed it.
Well, they bought the island in 1828, and the first institution that went up was the penitentiary, which was a penal institution for people convicted of serious crimes, short of murder. Those people generally went to Sing Sing, the state prison. But the exceptions to that were some women who were convicted of murder would end up in the penitentiary.
So the people that were hired to run the facilities, what are we talking that it was mostly law enforcement officers, or I guess in general, what type of people? I mean, they had to have they had people to clean it, I'm assuming, on some level, even if poorly. They had to have a medical staff of some sort. Where were these people from? Not really where they were from. I guess, what was their background, and was it kept? Is that where, I guess, maybe the chain links were weakest, I guess? Well,
it was run by a department called the Department of Public Charities and Correction. And that, again, it epitomizes the problem. They had three commissioners who were responsible for both charitable institutions and penal institutions. And these three men were hired based on their political influence and connections, and not at all on whether they had any experience in these positions. That said, they were responsible for all the hiring and firing on the island, down to the smallest person, mopping floors, to the wardens and doctors running the institutions. And the wardens, they were creative, and not in a bad way.
It's such a loose word. It's like creative,
Well, they would hire people with experience for the most part, but not always. I actually came across, every year they came, I'm trying to put things in context. Every year, the Department of Public Charities and Correction put out an annual report of what was going on in all these institutions. And each warden overseeing an institution had to report on the state of the institution for that year. And I read all these annual reports. And sometimes some of the most compassionate reports came from these wardens, who were not generally the most compassionate of men, but they, I'd say half the time, were. But I came across this one warden for the workhouse who just wrote with such kindness, and I hadn't read anything like this from one of the people running these institutions. So I looked into him. He was a reverend, and he had no experience running a penal institution. And so I looked into the time period when he was hired, and there was a lot of backlash against how these institutions were being run. And so for the first time, one of the commissioners for the Department of Public Charities and Corrections was a doctor. And he hired this guy. And I guess it was an experiment on his part. Like, let's put in a guy that isn't necessarily from the world of punishment and correction and see how he does.
Mm-hmm.
And he lasted a few years, and he instituted some really good practices, but he had just as hard a time as anyone else doing it well.
So one of the chapters of your book that I found really fascinating was a pretty famous, I didn't know so much about this person, but she seems to be a bit of a badass, is Nellie Bly.
Oh, she was totally a badass.
Right? I mean,
Yeah.
for her time especially, but even to today's standards, she was a genuine investigative journalist.
Yeah.
A name that I've always known, I knew very little about, and now I really want to know a lot more. But I think she's a prime example of the type of person who's really willing to put her neck on the line, because she was actually committed to just to get the story, really, to find out what was really going on behind these closed doors.
Yeah, she was amazing. So, yeah, she feigned mental illness in order to get herself committed to the lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island. And she was there 10 days, and she wrote about it, showed a series of articles, which eventually were put together in a book called 10 Days in the Madhouse. But one thing very interesting that I learned about what she did, because by the time I read her account, I had thoroughly researched the lunatic asylum. And one of the things that they did, they opened the asylum, and it was very quickly overcrowded. So they started building like other structures to house the people in the lunatic asylum. And they put up two buildings, one called the Retreat and one called the Lodge. And these became the most infamous buildings associated with the lunatic asylum. Like, everyone knew like how bad it was. Like, reports would come out. Other investigative reporters had written about them, and they were known as the most dangerous, terrible buildings of the lunatic asylum. So Nellie Bly originally intended to get herself put into one of these two buildings. But she was actually put into a section of the asylum that was considered the nicest part of the asylum. Like, they would regularly get visited by reporters, grand juries, and from the government, just checking about how they were running the asylum. So they had this one section where they would put the patients who were in the best condition, and it was the nicest part of the asylum. So whenever anyone visited the asylum, this is where they took them, so they would see it in the best possible light.
Right.
And that's where she was committed, in this section. And if you read, like, I put what I thought were some of the best parts of her articles in that chapter, but in the best part of the asylum, you read what happened to her, and it was just horrifying. And this is the best part of the asylum. So she realized, like, if this is, the safest part of the asylum, no way am I going to have myself put into the Retreat or the Lodge. And she totally backed out of that plan and stayed where she was. And she was right to do that. She could have possibly been killed in the other buildings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a smart move, and she was also very young. She was like in her 20s, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, she was amazing.
Yeah, and, she definitely led a pretty active life before and after that. I think she was attacked by the people who were running Mexico at the time. And I'm not 100% sure about that, but also she did, I believe she traveled around the world after that.
Yeah, she did.
She had a pretty active existence, so I think that's pretty... just a really fascinating person who gets put on the list of like, oh, I have to look more into this person.
Yeah, she was great.
So with Nellie Bly's work that she did put into this, did any change really come of this? Like,
No, and this is what kills me. Like, I would come across periodic uproars about how things were being run on the island, and I write about a big Senate investigation that took place a few years before Nellie Bly did her investigation. And every time there was a big uproar and people say, oh, we have to do something, and nothing changed again and again and again. And I have to say, it feels like what it's like now. Mm-hmm. Every day, there's some terrible thing I read about in the papers or in my tweets, and nothing ever happens. Nothing ever changes. It just keeps going on and on and on. But sympathy for the paralysis of that time period. But I specifically looked into what things were like for the women in the lunatic asylum after Nellie Bly's investigation. And the department was given more money than it was usually given the following year. And so I looked into what they spent it on. And unfortunately, well, not so unfortunately, but one of the biggest things that they did with that money was they built a place for the nurses to live. They lived in the asylum with the patients there. And so they built a building so that they could have their own housing. And I thought, okay, that's not such a terrible idea. Maybe if these nurses had better conditions, they wouldn't be so terrible to the inmates. And they could be very brutal, and which Nellie Bly writes about, and which I also write about. And so other than that, I think their budget for food went up a few cents. But the only substantial change I could find that might have made life better for the women was that they hired a couple of female doctors for the asylum.
I mean, that's pretty tremendous for the time.
It was. Unfortunately, the turnover was really high. And you mentioned this, like who worked there. The doctors that they got were often med school students, men who were still in school or recent graduates. So you'd have someone who's basically fresh out of school overseeing all the healthcare in the entire institution.
So free or lowest paid, basically.
Yeah.
I need the experience. Let's get it.
But I did find that one of the women that they hired, she lasted, I forget, maybe 2 years, but she kept notes of everything that happened. And later she had intended to write a book, which didn't happen, but there was another big investigation in the 1890s, and she testified at that investigation, and the stories that she told, which I put in my book, were again extremely horrifying but very enlightening.
I mean, it's just such an important record to have kept. I wonder if those notes still exist, and who has them, and possibly if they'll ever see light of day.
Well, I had a bunch of holy grails, and that was one of them, and I did not find those notes.
I mean, as horrible as it is to say, it's the kind of thing that would sell a lot right now, because these are the type of things that we want to know. We want to know, I guess, the history that we're not being taught.
Yeah.
That's true.
The book was challenging to write because not a lot of records were saved. There was almost nothing from the lunatic asylum. I had to piece it together from the what life was like there, from the annual reports, from these grand jury investigations that I would come across, people like Nellie Bly, and doctors who would write letters to their peers about what they were doing. Mm-hmm. It was a challenge trying to recreate exactly what went on.
Well, I think I'm going to say almost any book seems like a challenge, but your book is really, really informative. So how long did it take you to write Damnation Island anyway? I wish I had the other books in front of me, but unfortunately I just have the one.
That's okay.
But that's okay. But there is a lot of information here. It's not like, like, all right, well, it's this, and wait until my next book for more information. Like a lot of people do. How long did you spend studying, I guess, and researching for Damnation Island?
Well, I researched solidly for a year, and then I spent a year writing it. But while I was writing it, research was still going on. And even today, I can't let it go. I keep looking into things. I'm trying to think what... Oh, I remember. I'm reading a fascinating bio about Eliza Hamilton, the wife of Alexander Hamilton. Hold on one second. I just want to grab it.
Sure.
I just want to give this author some credit because she did such a good job. It's just coming out. I got an advanced copy. Tilar Mazzeo, Mazzeo, and it's a biography of Eliza Hamilton. But I read that one of her daughters was committed to the Bloomingdale Asylum. If you were poor and suffering from mental disorders in New York in the 19th century, you were sent to Blackwell's Island. But if you were wealthy, you would send, and some member of your family was suffering from some form of mental illness, you would go to a private, nice hospital, and the wealthy had the Bloomingdale Asylum. So,
of course, right?
Yes, yes, and that's true today, of course.
Of course, yeah. I mean, it's there's definitely retreats over rehabs, and.
But anyway, I found out from this biography that one of the children of Alexander and Eliza was committed to the Bloomingdale Asylum. And those records
lost you for a second there. I'm sorry. You
What?
cut out just for a moment. As soon as you said that that the person was committed to the Bloomingdale Asylum, it cut out.
Oh, okay.
But the records, and then it cut off.
It was their daughter, Angelica.
Okay.
And those records still exist. Like, I wrote about the story of Sister Mary, a nun who had been committed to Blackwell's Island and went to court to fight for her release. And she originally started at Bloomingdale Asylum, and I got her records there. So I want to see the records for the Hamilton's daughter. They're all protected by the HIPAA rules, so you can't publish anything.
Still, though? HIPAA still covers from that?
Still, it's forever, apparently. Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that. My wife works in the medical field. She oversees the entire social work department of a tremendous nursing facility, and she works her butt off. So she would understand the laws better than I. I think no. And I'm going to ask her about that, but she's probably going to just say, "Yep, that's totally true."
I think you can make general references, and the person who sent me the records for Sister Mary said, just contact me before you use any material in this, and I'll let you know what's okay and what's not okay. And it turns out that everything that I read in those records, I was able to find in other places. So
okay. Even better.
I didn't need to quote from them directly, but they did confirm what I learned elsewhere. So that was useful. Yeah,
I do like privacy laws and everything, but when we're talking about something from so long ago, that could impact something that's so major, it seems, silly in a way to cover it, to keep it so private, even if it's, 100 years ago, 80 years ago, 60 even.
Well, again, there's probably ways around it. If you're doing research about people committed to institutions, you might be able to use the information without saying which patients you're referring to. You could make generalizations like 100 patients a year were committed for this disorder, that kind of thing. Now,
in comparison to other major cities, because, we're New York City, we're the best, even back then, it's like we're the best. So were other facilities in other cities and parts of the country following the same rule of thumb? Like, were they really just as bad or much worse, better even?
I didn't really study them. The one in Philadelphia seemed better. I think there was one in Massachusetts that was also bad, but I just focused on Blackwell's Island.
Right, okay. I just didn't know if it kind of came across, a book maybe came across.
I do know that lunatic asylums in general were poorly run and continued to be poorly run until... well, I don't know if you're familiar with a documentary, an expose on Willowbrook.
It's funny. That's it's on my notes too. I'm like, I'm going to ask her about Willowbrook. I'm totally familiar with it. I've seen the footage that was shot by Geraldo Rivera, who it put his name on the map, really. And it's horrifying. You watch this right now, and it's Restless Sleep for Tonight. It's really sad. What was going on, 40 years ago.
right. In the 1970s, Geraldo Rivera, snuck into the Willowbrook Asylum with a camera and shot what he saw. And what I remember, because I saw it at the time and I haven't seen it since. But now I'm curious to Google it and watch it again. But what I remember is him walking down a long hallway, and there were people sitting all against the wall on either side, either naked, partially clothed, sitting in their own urine and feces, rocking back and forth, screaming and crying. I mean, it was just a nightmare that this was actually real. It wasn't a horror movie. This was something that was happening to real people. To me, that was worse than what I just read about in the lunatic asylum on Blackwells. That said, it was probably roughly the same. And in Blackwells, you're talking about the 19th century, so you didn't have electricity or plumbing on top of all this other terrible stuff.
Mm-hmm. I remember I used to live in Long Beach here on Long Island, and that was the big talk, is that when they shut down Willowbrook, I think they shut it down, a number of those people were brought to Long Beach to live. And this is one of those kind of things that I think I found maybe one Newsday article on it. Like, there's not much documentation on this one.
Yeah.
But they said that they brought all their problems to Long Beach, and that's why Long Beach sucked throughout the 80s. But now Long Beach is great and has its own facilities for people with issues. But so, yeah, it's a little bit of an urban myth. But I think there is like some legitimacy to it, that, they brought all these people here, these poor people. I mean, I feel for these people, and it's like, you know what, if they're going to have a window now that looks at the Atlantic Ocean and the beach, all the better. They deserve that.
Yeah. Well, I personally, I'm not buying it. At the time, the idea was, instead of these large institutions, they would have smaller group homes, which was probably more expensive than the institutions, which is why they didn't succeed. Mm-hmm. There was never enough money for them to run them properly. So now we're in a worse position. Well, let's just say equally bad position. But I think the idea, once again, that the mentally ill are more dangerous than the general population, I think is incorrect. There certainly are among them people with disorders that make them dangerous, but it's not all of them, and I don't know what percentage it is, but I would guess it's a very tiny percentage. Right,
and with the correct medication, I mean, we know this. It's something that can be. I'm sure I don't know for sure, but I have friends who, without their medication, may have ended up in something like this. But with their medication, they live normal, full lives.
Exactly.
And and everyone has problems, but when you do put somebody in these type of things, is another thing I came across in your book, where girls as young as 13 years old were coming in and they had syphilis, probably even younger, unfortunately, sadly, and they were being treated as though they were practical prisoners before they're even treated. So there's, I think, a certain level of clinical mental loss there. It's like you can't put a normal person around people who are criminally insane and expect everything to just kind of smooth itself out. Yeah. Especially when you have children.
No, they made everything worse.
Right. I mean, I can't imagine. Worse. I mean, I think back to when I was 13, and it's like, you're going to put me near somebody who, has serious issues. It's going to affect me. Also, in this time, in the late 19th century, girls were considered less able because they could sell flowers. They could sell newspapers, and unfortunately, they would sell their bodies.
Right.
Boys could sell a little bit more. They could sell like boots and a few more goods. But for the most part, and a lot of times these girls were just poor and they would get drugged and raped. And it's just, it's horrifying.
Yeah, they had very few options. But you brought up another interesting thing that I learned researching this book. But in the 19th century, if you were poor and you were sick and you required health care, you had to go to the Department of Outdoor Poor. And outdoor poor just meant that you were seeking help outside the home, not that you were, homeless.
Was that the real name, the Department of Outdoor Poor?
Yeah. And again, it just meant I know, it's a very confusing name.
Be creative.
So you had to prove that you were sick, you had to prove that you were poor, and if you proved those things, you would be sent to Bellevue if it was an emergency, and Blackwell's Island if it was not. So the only exception to this was if you were diagnosed with any form of venereal disease, the only way to get health care at that point was to go to police court and get yourself sent to the workhouse, which was a penal institution. So you had to basically become a convict and, put in, stripes and put in a jail cell in order to get health care for venereal disease. And as you said, there were no exceptions to this. If you were a child, you still had to go to the workhouse.
It's really unbelievable.
Yeah.
I like to think that we've come a much further way. At least there's cameras, At least a person can tweet somebody and tell on them or do something.
I don't think we have. I'm not an expert in this subject. My book ends in 1895, and it was a very hopeful year because the city was just finally saying, okay, we screwed up, and went about trying to fix each of the mistakes for each of the institutions. And they came up with plans for each one, which sounded, hopeful. Like, one of the things they did was they took the care of the mentally ill away from the city and gave it to the state. They decided that the penitentiary and the workhouse were just so terrible. The only thing to be done was to start over. So they bought Rikers Island, and once again, their plan was to build new state-of-the-art correctional institutions and just do better this time. So my book ends on a positive note for each institution, but I realized that, I need to write an epilogue just to say where we are now and what happened after 1895. So I started researching each of them, and one of the things I learned, I looked into Rikers Island. And I know just from reading newspapers that it was bad, but I just had no idea how horrifyingly bad it is. Here's another case where I have to say I learned things where it's worse than it was in the 19th century. Oh, it was terrible. Right as I was writing that book, Bill Moyers did a documentary about Rikers Island. And I know people say this, but it made me cry. I just we're all going to hell for this, that we allowed this institution to happen and to go on all this time, and it's still going on. I mean, it's supposed to be closed in 10 years, but it should be closed right now, right this moment. I mean, it
really?
You just have to, there's no exaggerating how bad it is. And I read this Department of Justice report about how teenagers are treated on Rikers Island, just because this became a thing for me, researching how teenagers were treated in the penitentiary and the workhouse. In the 19th century, they were sending children to these institutions. I found records of children as young as 8 years old being sent to these prisons, which just, again.
Yeah, I mean, I have a 10-year-old son. I cannot imagine.
I know. And then, there was a separate prison for them.
They're coming for you right now.
You can hear that?
No, it's fine.
So there was a separate correctional institution for children on Randall's Island, but they also still sent them to the adult prisons. And so there was outrage about this at the time, about raising the age, and I think they raised it to 14 when my book ends. So just imagine that. It took a huge battle just to make the cutoff 14. And even though they made the cutoff 14, I still found records of children being sent there anyway. So that's that. So I see that they raised it to 14. And when I'm reading about how teenagers are treated on Rikers Island, I realize, here we are 150 years later, and it's now only been raised to 16. So they are still sending children to prisons with adults. And so I read about the treatment, and again, it's just, you just can't imagine. I tell about one story of this kid who mouthed off to guard. So he was dragged out of a classroom, and the teacher and the students are told to look away, but this teacher was interviewed later, and she did not look away, and she described what she saw and what she heard, and they just proceeded for the next, I forget how many minutes, just beat the hell out of this kid. But it doesn't end there. Like, she describes how another guard wasn't there at the beginning, walked by and said, "Hey, have you pepper sprayed him yet?" And they said, "No, go ahead." And he held the pepper spray just inches from this kid's eyes and sprayed into his eyes. And they just, stories of kids that had to have metal plates put in their head after being beaten. I mean, you just can't, who can fathom who would do something like that?
For some reason, as a culture, and hopefully I don't buy into it personally, but we accept these things because they're happening in prisons. They're happening.
Right. And these are criminals, and they have it coming to them. But that was another thing I learned researching this book. On Blackwell's Island, one of the things that you discover is that wealthy people were never sent there. And we know the wealthy commit crimes, so it's just, what's going on?
Really?
And
they were never sent there?
Very rarely. I mean,
of course there's
but very, very rarely. It's probably less than 1% for the entire history of the island.
Holy cow!
But even the wardens would notice this injustice, and I quote this one warden who just comes right out and says it in his annual report. He goes, "I know the wealthy commit crimes, but you only send poor criminals to me, so what's the deal?" And he comes right out and says it, and he says, "This proves to me that the wealthy can evade punishment and commit crimes freely." And the Women's Prison Association did their own investigation, and they went to the courts just to see what happens. Like, when you got arrested in New York in the 19th century, the first place you were taken to was police court. And the judges there, who were members of the police department, so conflict of interest right there, they could dispose of some of them right away on their own if it was a relatively minor crime like disorderly conduct or intoxication. They had the power to just send the people straight to Blackwell's Island. If it was a more serious crime, they would be held to go to a different court, a superior court like General Sessions.
Mm-hmm.
So the Women's Prison Association sat on this court just to see what would happen. And they said if a more affluent New Yorker was brought in, which was not often, their cases were either dismissed or they were charged a fine and sent home. And the only people that were sent to prison or held for other trials were poor people
who couldn't pay the fine, even if there was one imposed.
Yeah, and they would be charged. And I looked into the fines that were charged, and they would be charged something like $500, which was insane. I mean, no poor person had that kind of money. And the same is true today. I've started to become like an advocate about this. The fact that white collar criminals, like there's a law that's still in the book called disorderly conduct, and it's basically if you're making a nuisance of yourself in public, the police can arrest you. But it's worded so broadly that in practice, it came to mean whatever the police and the courts wanted it to mean, and they could target groups that they wanted to keep in line. And in the 19th century, that was Irish immigrants, women, and the poor. And so that's who they were arresting for disorderly conduct, and that's who they were sending to jail. And there were other statutes, aimed towards the crimes of the wealthy that were also broadly worded, so they could have used it at their discretion. Statutes against fraud, for instance,
mm-hmm.
But they didn't use them. They didn't apply them.
I hate to bring up like TV shows, but on Netflix they have a show called Orange is the New Black, which is almost unwatchable. So, but they do touch upon, in the most recent season, the different levels of cleanliness and I guess, things you get. And they have one particular prison that has like cell block A, B, C, and D being the worst. So if you go to A, you're getting all of these amenities. You're not considered as much of a hostile person. So your goal is to obviously go that way. I think it touches a little bit on that. But one of the things that it did touch upon seasons ago is how we as a people really use prison labor. And that's another thing. It's a business. Yeah. And a lot of telemarketing, a lot of hands-on sewing and things like that are being done by these people who are incarcerated. And very often they're being incarcerated for like a total light reason. There's really no reason why this person should.
Well, that's the thing. Like, our criminal justice system has evolved so that even the smallest misdeeds of the poor are crimes and jailable offenses, where the largest misdeeds of the affluents are considered ethical issues and not really crimes, and they're not sent to jail for them.
Right, like financial crimes, for instance.
Exactly.
I'm sorry that you're broke now. I'm sorry you have no money to pay your bills and you're going to go to jail because you're not paying taxes because you can't afford to. But the guy who stole all that money, well, he's living life in a really nice prison. Maybe not a very nice, but, not as bad as these horror stories that you're talking about.
Well, and that's another thing. The idea of separate prisons is also unjust. And I wrote an op-ed about this. Like, if Rikers Island was filled with as many white-collar criminals as any other type of criminal, it would never have become the hellhole that it is today.
Mm-hmm. It's really, it's very eye-opening. I do have one very weird question. This came up, I was talking, I don't know if you're familiar with this guy. He's been around he's a writer. His name is John C. Dvorak. I don't know. He does a lot of writing for Market Watch. And I met him once and we were talking briefly about the history in New York, like darker history. And he said, and I've sent him several emails, and he said he cannot find the article and he's kicking himself, that there was a period of time where they were giving out lobotomies in Central Park. Did you ever come across anything like this, where it would almost be like a pop-up Central Park, turn of 19th to 20th century-ish type of time, where you can go there and literally get a lobotomy practically on the spot?
No, and I actually just read a book about the history of lobotomies. It was called Patient HM, I believe. Very well done. There was nothing about that.
It's ridiculous,
in the book.
Right? All right.
Well, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. But
I just wish he could find the article so I can, take those facts and see if they connect to anything else, because I've never heard of anything like that. And it just seems to be one of those type of things where, if that's true, that it's just very eye-opening for the time. That's all.
Well, you should read this book, Patient HM. It's very eye-opening about just how many lobotomies were
it was so
done.
Popular.
Yeah.
Oh, you want to look younger? Get a lobotomy. Gives you that nice, smooth look. So you do have other books that I guess tie into the kind of stuff that we talk about on the show normally. One of which is called Unbelievable Investigations into Ghosts, Poltergeist, Telepathy, and Other Unseen Phenomena from Duke Parapsychology Laboratory. I'm sorry, go on.
No, what were you going to ask?
Oh, no, I was going to say, it sounds like a study that Duke had done, that Duke University had done to try to prove the existence of these phenomena.
Yeah, they started this department, and they brought in scientists, and the goal was to see if they could come up with experiments that would find evidence for life after death. So that was their goal. That was their charge. And for 30 years, they had this lab where they did devise experiments to see if they could see if there was any scientific evidence for life after death. And just had so much fun researching that book. But one of the things that I did when I first got there, I requested the archives for the lab are in the Special Collections Library at Duke University, and the first files that I opened were full of math and it was all over my head. It was like a lot of statistics, and I had to learn a lot about statistics to write this book.
Oh boy.
But
I remember those days, like Trig 3 and stuff like that.
I wish I knew more statistics. I wish I was
Now
more
you
of an.
do.
I do regret that I didn't, take that more seriously and learn more. But anyway, so while I was like getting up to speed with that, what I did was at the time, the Parapsychology Laboratory was pretty much the only game in town in terms of serious research for the paranormal. And they were very famous because, it's an alluring subject. And
Sure.
So any research that they did, newspapers around the country would immediately pick up on it and publish their results and what they were doing. So they became very famous, so that if you were living in that time period and something weird happened to you, you would write the lab and say, look, here, this happened. What's going on? What does it mean? Help me. And so there are thousands and thousands and thousands of these letters in the library at Duke University. It's basically a history of everything weird that happened in America in this time. And just going through these letters is, if you're into this kind of thing, is just so much fun. And so I took a selection of the more interesting letters and made chapters out of them in my book.
Wow. And this is a study that went on from 1930 to 1980, right?
Well, it was part of Duke from the 30s to the 60s, and when Ryan retired, they shut down the lab. Duke University was always a little bit embarrassed about it towards the end. But Ryan continued to fundraise and was able to keep the lab going until the 80s.
Wow.
Now,
Yeah,
actually, it still exists to this day, I should say. It's just Ryan died, and now it's run by his daughter.
oh, really?
Yeah.
What is it called? I know it's Dr. J.B. Ryan, but what is the
It's
study called?
Well, now it's called the Ryan Research Center.
Oh, okay. Yeah, when you first came across this, or rather, how did you first come across this? This seems to be like one of these kind of little known facts that a study like this even existed from a place as prestigious and well respected as Duke.
Well, I'd heard of it, but it actually came about. I had just finished my book about the NYPD's Cold Case Squad. This is a group of detectives who go back through old unsolved homicides to see if they can solve them. So I spent, a year or two researching that and writing that, and it was fascinating, but ultimately depressing because it always came back to somebody dying in a terrible way. So I wanted my next book to be something more fun and more light, and I thought, what's more fun than a ghost story? And I'll write a ghost story. Of course, forgetting that a ghost story, once again, begins with someone dying.
Right.
And I was going to write about a ghost story I'd heard about as a kid that took place in the Morris Jamel Mansion uptown. I don't know if you ever heard about this, but supposedly this mansion that George Washington visited and is now a landmark and a museum where people can visit in New York. Once it was built by a merchant, Stephen Jamel, and he lived there with his wife, Eliza Jamel, who, after he died, she married Aaron Burr.
Oh, okay, that's weird.
I know. So she said to haunt it. So I wrote a book proposal to write about that, to research her, and whether or not there was any truth to the haunting. And one publisher read it and said, this is very interesting. But I have to say, I grew up in North Carolina, not far from Duke, and I know that they had a parapsychology laboratory, but I don't know what went on in there. Why don't you write a book about them and their experiments and the scientists there, the way you did about the detectives and the work that they did in the Cold Case Squad? And I just loved that idea. And I said, absolutely. So I went down to Duke and started that research.
You cover so much. so many different topics. I mean, you do have a correlation between a lot of these things, and you can kind of see where your next idea kind of comes from a little bit.
Yeah.
Very little bit. No, I mean, there's an inkling there, but it's almost like you take it and you really turn it into a real piece, and I think that's awesome.
Thank you.
One other thing that really fascinated me when I was looking up your name is going back to the time when I was first getting into coding and on the BBS networks and stuff like that, when I had like a 286 computer. You started what is considered to be the first social network that was published online, called Echo.
Well, it wasn't the first, but it was early.
Let's say it was one of the first organized efforts.
I have such a roundabout professional history, but I always wanted to be a writer, but I figured, it's hard to be a writer. It's hard to get books published, and I need a plan B in the meantime. And I just kind of fell into telecommunications. I was, I think, 22 years old, 23 years old, and there was an ad in the Times for a job that said, someone who works as well with machines as they do with people. And I really didn't have a lot of experience. This is, by the way, and I didn't have a lot of, no, it was the 80s, I'm sorry. I didn't have a lot of experience with machines, but that was such an interesting ad. Mm-hmm. I had to answer it. And it turned out it was a job with computers, and they would teach you. And my job was to hook up people around New York City to a main computer in the city. And I learned about telecommunications. Right. Yeah.
Like they would dial into like a BBS type of network, or?
Kind of, yeah. Okay. And so it wasn't a BBS though. They were sharing data.
Okay.
And so a very internet-oriented kind of application. So I learned about people to each other. So went from job to job, and I was working for the Mobil Corporation, an oil company. And the head of the department walked into my office one day, and he said, "You're never up the corporate ladder if you don't have a graduate degree." And I didn't really want to move up the corporate ladder, but graduate school sounded fun because I was trying to figure out a more fun way to make a living while I still tried to be a writer. Sure. And so I picked this program at NYU called the Interactive Telecommunications Program. And I picked it because it had telecommunications in the title and because I didn't have to take the GRE to apply. And I got accepted, and it ended up being this new media playground where they were just experimenting with all these things that are now commonplace today. And they introduced us to the internet and social networks. And I had an assignment to call an online service called The Well in California, which would now be called a social network. We called them virtual communities at the time. Mm-hmm. And I loved it so much, and that's where I got the idea to do Echo in New York.
Have you ever thought about restarting it?
It's still it still exists.
Well, I mean, I guess relaunching it, kind of, because, there is a need for something that, clearly, I mean, you saw like just a week ago, with Facebook stock crumbling and making a lot of people lose a lot of money and faith in a product that, is basically being run by the same people who set up all of these insane asylums. The same kind of corporate people the same type of money-hungry people who let that kind of stuff happen. Maybe not specifically, but, maybe not exactly, but at the same time, turning one thing that existed into another. I always wonder why... a lot of people jump on the Facebook, and essentially Facebook has become what AOL wanted to be in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
It's like you're in their little sandbox.
Well...
And it is little,
excuse me?
I'm sorry, I'm just saying it's like a sandbox, and it's very little. And there's more out there. But I do think that there is another thing coming there's been a lot of efforts, but I think that the tremendous selling point of something like Echo would be the fact that it existed far before probably 99% of the websites that exist right now.
You dropped out a lot just now.
Oh, I'm
I missed
sorry.
a lot of words.
I was jibber jabbering anyway. I'm just basically, I'm always pushing people to relaunch something in a big way, I guess.
Well, that takes money.
I know, it takes money. Here's the money. No, so, but anyway, I guess that's stuff that Kickstarter's for, right? Instead of buying a laptop case that keeps your, iPad cool, maybe they can invest in something like that. Just food for thought, that's all. Okay. Well, Stacy, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time out today to speak with me. I'm sorry we're having like a few dropouts here and there.
That's okay. I really appreciate your inviting me. I am grateful for any attention to be brought to my book. I worked really hard on it. I would love for more people to read it. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to put a link to not only your website, which is stacyhorn.com, but also a link to all of your books on Amazon. Do you do autographed copies at all? Yeah, I mean, if people buy it and send it to me, I'll sign it and send it back. You'll be surprised how many people don't do that. It's so weird. I know somebody who lives near Stephen King. And Stephen King, if you buy his book and he's like a drop-off slot, you could just drop it in there and it comes back within like 10 or 15 minutes if he's around. Oh my God! How cool is that, right? Yeah, it makes you want to take a trip up north and just kind of experience that, right? Yeah. But, so I just think that that's really cool. I know a lot of people are autograph collectors and, I think it's pretty cool. No, I'd be happy to do that. All right. Well, thank you, Stacy, so much for, again today. And I hope to speak to you really soon. Now that you've been on the show, I said before, I'll probably pester you every once in a while to, no, that'd be great. Thank you. I appreciate it. Actually, I know one question I wanted to ask you. Is there something coming, next? Like, are you working on a project right now for something? Well, I'm mulling over a couple of ideas. I want to write about the Board of Health, but I haven't sold my publisher on that idea yet. But I learned about them researching this book. If you drive by Roosevelt Island now, ruins on the southern end of a hospital that's known as the smallpox hospital. Mm-hmm. And I don't write about that in my book because the hospital was taken over by the Board of Health and moved to another island. And the smallpox hospital became a nursing school. Oh. But I just looked into the Board of Health and their early history, and it's utterly fascinating. It was originally it was a group of scientists, doctors, and detectives, NYP detectives, and they were charged with finding out what is causing the death of New Yorkers, like what are all the ways that New Yorkers die, and what can we do to minimize that? Like, how can we stop these cholera outbreaks and these yellow fever outbreaks, and how can we improve the abysmal infant mortality rates in New York? Like, what can we do to keep people alive longer? So to me, it's just fascinating, but for some reason, my publisher thinks it sounds kind of dry. Well, maybe they'll get a change of opinion, because the Board of Health and all of these kind of boards and rules and laws are changing so dramatically right now. Yeah. Like I said, my wife is in the field, so she sees on a daily basis, like she has to go to these lectures, and she's like, you're not going to believe this and that. But she can't believe how not computerized everything is. Not everything has been, everything is still such a paper existence. Yeah. And, that is such, when you look at the budgets of some of these places, just the amount of money to store the paper, it's disgusting. Like there's, what is it called? Iron Mountain. These are warehouses just full of paper. No, I know. And I'm not surprised. When I was writing about the NYPD's cold case squad, I mean, how much was still on paper? But again, it costs money to scan that stuff and computerize it, which they don't have or didn't have.
It's just weird that, they're paying an astronomical fee to store it. It's almost like if you were to take, maybe a 5-year budget of what you're paying and apply it to this, you could probably digitize the entire thing. Maybe they're waiting for the government to subsidize that. I'm not sure. Either way, I do appreciate your time coming on to the show, and you'll hear from me very soon. Forcing me to hide around the stream, let me come through. Even their mind, revel the dark, exuberant display, carried away. Black and blue robe, complimented nicely by a ripe